Good morning. It's good to see all of you. I'm glad to be here to worship with you. I'm glad you made it. It's been a tough morning for travel. For those who don't know me, if you're visiting, and we have a few visitors, I think because of baptism, pretty exciting. My name is Norman. My family and I have been coming to Mosaic for a little while now, I think a little over 2 years. And we're part of the Sunnyside community in Queens, on the other side. That's really hard to get to. We've been here for a while. We're grateful for the Mosaic community and the various ways that we seek as a community to embody the way of Jesus in our lives. The past few weeks, it's been good having some new faces in the midweek group out in Queens. I think every time I share from up here, I always give a little update from Queens, because why not? There were some people that were coming for the first time. There are some people who have been coming that have seen each other for the first time. You know who you are. And we started a new series in our discussions together on the Shema, which is a prayer from Deuteronomy. And I'm grateful for the ways that the Spirit is speaking through us, speaking to us through one another, even if the whole discussion that we've been having on Wednesdays is around one word. It's around a single word, and we see the Spirit, we hear the Spirit speak to us so powerfully. So I'm constantly learning. That's the posture that we have at Mosaic, that we're constantly learning from each other, responding to the ways that Jesus is revealing to us how he's calling us to live our lives in this city. So just a little update from Queens. You're welcome to join us. Not everyone there is from Sunnyside, and we'll have you here. That's Wednesday. Come. Let us know though, so we can prep. But today is not Wednesday. It is Sunday. And if you've been with us for the last several weeks since Easter, we're in this season of Eastertide, where we are having little Easters every Sunday. And we've been reading through the lectionary. It's a series of readings in the church, and looking at the early church through various passages in the book of Acts. And one skip hop backwards to Luke for a little bit, but it's the same author, so it's okay. And last week, Pastor Yolanda reminded us that as we're following this story, we're following the move of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the main character in Acts. And as an aside, if you weren't here last week, I really encourage you to listen to last week's sermon. Give it a listen. I was so moved listening, and I was challenged by the word last week. So go look it up. If you're online, you already know where to find it, but it's on our YouTube page. Just an encouragement to listen there. Today we're continuing that same story in Acts, but we're skipping forward a bit. You saw that today's passage was in Acts 7, and it's the stoning of Stephen, the story of Stephen. And the passage covers his death, when he's dragged out of the city and he's stoned by an angry mob. It's not really a feel-good passage. It's certainly not a passage I would choose for a baptism Sunday, because it's like, look what you have to look forward to. Like that's not the idea of the passage. I promise you that's not what we're going to end at. But we're following the move of the Spirit as she empowers the followers of Jesus who are devoted to his teaching to live it out. And before we can understand what's going on in this passage, why the crowds were so enraged that they would kill him, we need to look at how we got here. So while we read those verses, we're actually going to go backwards and look at just the story of Stephen. You'll see a few passages up here, because we need to look at how we got there. We need to look at the context. Otherwise, we might come to a passage like this and we might glorify martyrdom for martyrdom's sake, and that doesn't help anybody. And we completely miss the kind of life that we're called to, a life that challenges status quo, a life that welcomes those on the margins, a life in the Spirit. So we heard from the end of chapter 7, but to know what led to his death, we need to get to know Stephen a little bit better. Stephen enters into the story. He enters into the chat in chapter 6, and he's introduced along with 6 other Hellenists, which means Greek-speaking. He's introduced along with 6 other Hellenist believers to address a problem that was happening in this growing community. discrimination. Something that we might be familiar with if you've lived in New York. And at the beginning of chapter 6, in verse 1, we learn that the Hebrews, that's what our translation calls the Hebrew-speaking believers in Jerusalem. We learn that the Hebrews, the hosts, the ones who were in the majority, the ones who held all the resources because they lived there, right? They were only caring for their own. And they were neglecting the needs of the Hellenists. They were only caring for their own and neglecting, whether it was intentional or not, whether it was just fear or don't know what to do around people who are different from me, they were neglecting the needs of the Hellenists. And Stephen, along with those 6 others I mentioned, being a Hellenist himself, his name is Greek, so we know he spoke Greek. Stephen, being a Hellenist himself, who likely experienced that same discrimination, stuck up noses when he walked by or when he spoke, and you can tell something's different about his speech, unfriendly, othering stares that he would get, all these microaggressions that he likely would have experienced. We learn that Stephen was tasked with pursuing wholeness. So he gets to it. Someone who's devoted to the ways of teaching. He pursues wholeness. He elevates the lowly. He cares for the needy. He sought the justice of Jesus as he knew. And he bore good fruit. After this little interruption about this discrimination, the text will tell us that the group continued to grow. And this is the glimpse that Acts gives us of who Stephen is. That's how the gospel shaped him, how the gospel transformed him to live a life of love. This is the glimpse we get of him before the conflict that leads to his death. So let me read about that conflict, and we'll continue from there. This is from the end of chapter 6. I'm starting from verse 9, so follow along. Then some of those who belonged to the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and others of those from Cilicia and Asia, stood up and argued with Stephen. But they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which he spoke. Then they secretly instigated some men to say, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God." They stirred up the people as well as the elders and the scribes. Then they suddenly confronted him, seized him, and brought him before the council. They set up false witnesses who said, "This man never stopped saying things against this holy place," that's the temple, "and the law," that's from Moses. "For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place, the temple, and will change the customs that Moses handed on to us." That was the charge. See, if before the discrimination that we were talking about was between the Hebrew-speaking people and the Greek-speaking people, between the Hebrews and the Hellenists, in this particular showdown, it's actually Hellenists versus Hellenists. Greek-speaking versus Greek-speaking, because the freedmen, as you saw in the passage, they were from the diaspora. They were Hellenists. The freedmen were called that because they were former slaves of other nations who had somehow gained their freedom. But with that freedom, they navigated the world a little differently than the Hellenists mentioned before that were discriminated against. They navigated the world a little differently. The freedmen, instead of trying to hold on to their cultural identities, they sought to assimilate to the culture of those in power. They might have even boasted to others like, "I grew up on the margins. I'm a Hellenist. I spoke Greek. I'm not one of the chosen people." They might have boasted that they were on the margins, but they would also say, "But I made it. I made it." They left their cultural identities behind, and then they got along with power. See, by conforming, playing into the established system, they secured their place in society. So when Stephen comes along with the early church, with the followers of Jesus, and they allow different cultures to be welcomed as they are, that's a threat. Because what would happen if you include people as they are who don't go through the system? It would change the system that the freedmen worked so hard to be accepted in. Because from their point of view, they're like, if I had to go through the system, well, then you have to go through the system. I made it, and I'm a foreigner. Why can't you? You do it. And do you see what's happening in this passage? It happens today. I see it in my own story. Do you see what's happening here? For me, I see the model minority myth in the book of Acts. I see the model minority myth in the book of Acts. It has the same shape. It pits the powerless against the powerless to enshrine power, to keep those that are actually in power. It makes us on the bottom fight one another. See, for the freedmen who had bought into the structures of empire, and they succeeded, or at least it looked like it. For the freedmen who had bought into the structures of empire and succeeded, they fought to keep it as is. They knew how to work the system. They're practiced. They knew what to say. They knew who to please. There was kind of a safety in it, right? It's predictable. You know how the machine works. Because when you work in the system, those in power approve of you, and they elevate you, and it feels good. They give you jobs. Yes, they grant you access. They listen to your complaints, your requests, your accusations as it's happening here. And you can be so certain when you play into the system that you're right because things are working for you. At least it looks like it. Never mind that they don't work for everyone else. If I did it, you can do it. So get in line. The Hellenists would be saying it works. So they strive to keep it this way. And if you are in Hellas and you notice shifts, changes in culture, the makeup of your community looks a little different, you get a little nervous. And you might say things like, let's go back to when things were great. Perhaps we can make it, you're laughing too early, great again? And the freedmen, what they did was that they would center the land. You see it in this passage. They centered the land. That's connected to the promise, the law. They centered the land. They centered the temple because they knew that's what mattered to the people in power. And they bring their accusations against Stephen. When they do that, they claim that all that centering that they're doing is in the name of God. And they're essentially saying, when you don't live like us, you go against Moses. When you don't uphold the temple, you go against God. When you don't live like us, adopt our culture, you go against Moses. And when you don't uphold the temple, you go against God. And before I get to Stephen's response, I'm sure you already noticed my not so subtle nod to Christian nationalism. But before we start thinking that the critique is about those on the outside, I think we in the church need to take a hard look at ourselves. We need to pull the giant plank out of our own eye before we start taking specks all over the place out of everyone else's. Because we in the church have done exactly what the freedmen are doing. We've done exactly the same thing. In our world, as I'm talking to my friends who were in the church or currently are on the margins, in our world, there are people who want to see God. They're longing for it. They want to hear his voice, to experience his love, his grace, to know that they belong. But the church for so long has said things like, if you don't live like us, if you don't vote like us, if you don't interpret the Bible like we do, if you don't believe the things we believe about science, there's so many things. If you don't conform to our view of biblical manhood and womanhood, if you don't agree with us on abortion, if you don't uphold our views of marriage and sexuality, if there are any of those things that you don't agree with, then you're out. You go against God. And the people who are hungering for God, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, they don't even know that Jesus is praying. They're hungering, they end up walking away. They walk away. And these are the sad realities of Western church history, Western church present. Realities that I think we in the church, before we point the finger elsewhere, we must contend with. We must repent of. And when I read this passage and see this dynamic, I'm asking, where have we put up walls? How have we turned people away from the love of Jesus? The freedmen, with the establishment, they accuse Stephen of going against God. But Stephen's response turns their accusations on its head. Now, I'm not going to read all of Stephen's response. It's the longest speech in the book of Acts. But I'll tell you about it. If you do have time, you can follow along. You can watch this again on YouTube and follow along. If you look at Stephen's speech, he goes from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. He goes through the story of Joseph all the way to Moses and the wilderness wanderings. And if you're reading that, at first glance, it looks like he's just giving a history lesson. As if he's saying, you're accusing me of not honoring Moses and the temple? Well, I know the story of our people. Let me tell you history. But if you look a little closer, if you look at what he's saying, Stephen is very intentional in how he tells this story. See, for the establishment, Jerusalem was everything. Jerusalem was everything. The temple, its very center. This temple, this place is where God is. But Stephen's retelling of Israel's history highlights God's presence not here, not in the temple. I mean, he is in the temple, but he highlights that God's presence is out there. God's presence is out there among the nations. God is out there meeting his people where they are. God was with Abraham when he was in the country of the Chaldeans. God was with his people even when they were resident aliens in a foreign land. In the Joseph story, when Joseph was sold by his brothers and taken to Egypt, God was with him in Egypt. In Joseph's day, God's salvation actually came from Egypt. Of all places, if you were an Israelite, Egypt would be the very last place you would expect God's salvation to come. Egypt was a symbol of their oppression. But he goes on, Moses was born in Egypt and God was with him there. When Moses was rejected by his people, he fled to Midian, if you remember the story. And God was with him there too. God appeared to him there. And this is the part that usually makes it into the movies. God appeared to him there on a mountain in a burning bush. And God said that place where he was, do you remember what happened there? In that place where Moses was standing, God said to him, take off your shoes, because this place is what? Holy ground. This place far away from the temple, God says, was holy ground. And finally, look at this. When Stephen then goes on the last thing that gets him thrown out, Stephen makes this comparison from arguably the lowest point in Israel's history in the wilderness with Moses. See verse 41. It says, at that time, they, Israel, made a calf, offered a sacrifice to the idol, and then reveled in the works of their hands. At that time, Israel made a calf, offered a sacrifice to the idol, and reveled in the work of their hands. Remember that phrase, the work of their hands. After some time, Stephen talks about the tent of testimony, the tabernacle. He talks about the temple that was finally built, their pride and joy. But then Stephen adds this scathing rebuke. In verse 48, he says, yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made with human hands. The Most High does not dwell in houses made with human hands. Do you see how this story is going? How he's lining these up? The works of their hands that made the calf, and this house made with human hands. The language is the same. Stephen is saying to them, to the freedmen, to the establishment that are marginalizing others, Stephen is saying, the temple has become your new golden calf. The temple has become your new golden calf. It has become their God. The way they tried to elevate themselves, their culture over others, conform or get out, that has become their idol. They were so transfixed on this static temple, keeping culture the way it is, the church as it's always been, apparently. And they fail to follow the dynamic movement of the Spirit. The scriptures tell us that the Spirit moves. He's out there, he's meeting. Holy ground is where God's people are. The way of the Lord has always been going out and inviting others in, drawing in even the least expected. It was happening right in front of their faces, and they couldn't see it. The nations were there. Do you remember Jesus' parable, his teaching about the master who hosts a great banquet? If you don't, I am here. Let me remind you. This happens in Luke 14. There's a master who hosts a great banquet, and he sends out his messengers to all the people that should be invited. The nobles, the rich people, all the insiders. The master says, come. But they were all too busy with their own blessings. Their own idols were taking up all their time to heed the master's invitation. So the master expands his invitation. He sends his messengers out again. Go out into the streets, the highways and byways, the lanes of the town. Bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame, the people who were outcasts, the ones that were different. Bring them in. So his messengers come back and they report to the master, it's done. But there's more. It says, but there's still room. There's still room. And finally, the master says to his messengers, go out to the roads again, to the lanes, and compel people, urge them, woo them in, so that my house may be filled. So that my house may be filled. Church, this is the heart of God, to welcome, to bless, to bring all people in. And if you're here and you have not experienced this before, if you haven't experienced this, but in the church you've experienced exclusion, told that you could not belong because of something you did, or you're shunned because you asked too many questions during a class, or you asked the wrong type of questions, or even if they don't say it, you just feel it, the tension in the room. If you're told that you don't belong because of who you are, because of your background, because of the way that you eat, because of your family, because of your politics, because of your sexuality. I'm sorry that the church has championed this message of exclusion. When we're afraid, especially if we don't know when we're afraid, we can commit all kinds of evil in the name of God. I'm sorry that as a recovering Bible thumper, as a recovering biblicist, I'm sorry that the place that should have lived out full inclusion, welcome and embrace, love over fear and shame, did not live out the gospel that the church embodied here in the book of Acts. And I'm sorry that the church has said conform, get in line or get out. Know that that is not the heart of God. That is not the heart of God. God is not about coercion or building empire. Jesus says that his kingdom is not like the kingdoms that we built. Jesus does not amass power. He shares it. His nature is to give. He desires that his house be filled. This is the heart of God. This is love in action. Do you see how, as Stephen traced history, or as I retraced it for you, do you see how the Spirit moves out? The circle expands to those who would have never thought they would be included in the church, welcomed in. I can be who? I can be a child of God. I can be welcomed in. I could belong. Do you see how God's love breaks in, challenges our understanding of who's in and who's out? Do you see how this kind of love, this radical inclusion, is the most powerful force in the world? And I really mean that. This love is the most powerful force in the world. This love from this one person standing before a council, this love threatens empire. And it can soften hearts. It transforms enemies, people like Saul that we read here, into family. Because that's what's going on at the end when the crowd stones Stephen to death. At his death, Stephen witnesses to a love that cannot die. Even Saul, and we can't get into all of Saul, he's kind of important, but we got to move on. Another week, I'm sure you'll hear about him sometime. Even Saul, who approved of Stephen's death and led a vicious campaign to destroy the early church, he ends up spreading it. Stephen witnesses to a love that cannot die, to a love that does not need to retaliate. It does not need to use the methods of empire to defeat empire. Love has a far more effective means of winning, so to speak. It should not be lost on us as we look at this passage that Stephen here, in his death, perfectly mirrors Jesus on the cross. Stephen, while he's dying, he asked Jesus to receive his spirit, just as Jesus prayed to the Father, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." And just as Jesus prayed, as his accusers were nailing him to a cross, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." Stephen prays for his enemies, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." Sometimes I wonder if that prayer, if Saul heard it. But Saul for another time. Stephen had the boldness and confidence to love like this because he knew that death was not an obstacle for the love of Christ. He knew that in Jesus' resurrection, love had already conquered death. He saw the resurrected Jesus. It says it twice in our passage, standing at the right hand of God. Jesus' love freed Stephen, and it frees us to love with utter abandon. And when we are devoted to that kind of love, we are the fullest version of ourselves. We become who we're called to be. So Mosaic, in our city, what does that love look like? What does that love look like? I love that in many ways, as I've been here in this community, you've already been showing me that answer. I'm grateful that the love of Jesus for us is not merely an idea. It's not something that we just say with our lips, but it takes on hands and feet in our community. I love that. But at the same time, there's an encouragement here to go deeper. Just as the messengers reported back to the master, we've already brought those people in, and there's more room. I wonder, who do we think of? Who do we think would never walk into church because they fear they'd be excluded? And how can we extend God's welcome to them? Not extend rules or behaviors or viewpoints to conform to, but this unconditional love and welcome that we've experienced. I pray that we'd be attentive to the Spirit moving. That sometimes that calls us, it challenges us to expand, to reimagine what's possible, to reimagine who can be in, to expand what love can look like. Because that's our call as followers of Jesus, to be for the good of others. Is it hard? Yeah, it's hard. Will we get discouraged? Talk to anyone here who has tried. They'll have a story for you. For those who follow Jesus, who are baptized in his name, know this from the one who once held a stone to stone Stephen, but then experienced the love and welcome of Jesus. He said that we join with his sufferings. We'll have a hard time. We join in his sufferings for the sake of the world. If we do that, we'll also join with Jesus in his resurrection life. Church, we're called to practice a love that cannot die. Jesus said to his disciples, and he says to us this morning, and let this be my closing encouragement to you. Jesus says to us, in the world you'll have trouble, or for the King James, you'll have tribulation. But be of good cheer. Take heart. Courage, dear heart. I have overcome the world.